Hello. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. My name's Brendan Gillies, and I will be moderating the session today called From Builders to Leaders, the role of contractors and suppliers in a changing climate. Today we have 4 esteemed panelists who've been focused on these areas within their career for the past several years, and they have lots to share with us. Before we get started, though, could we maybe do a quick poll of the room? Who in the room today is actually representing an owner organization within Procore? Okay, right on. Who would be representing more of a GC? Okay, most of the room here. And anybody who would call themselves a subcontractor or a specialty trade? Okay, a few of those as well. So that's awesome to see that we've got so many different people representing us today. Joining me on stage today, we've got Sandra Benson from Procore. We have Monica Serrano from Turner, Joel Sonkin from Deloitte, and we also have Gonzalo Galindo from Cemex Ventures. Before we get started today, do you each mind giving yourselves a brief introduction and talking about how you ended up here today?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sandra Benson. I'm Vice President of Industry Transformation here at Procore. I also serve on the Board of Directors of the National Institute of Building Sciences, which is partially how I got here today. I've been in the industry about 30 years as an owner and a contractor in technology. So good to see you guys.
Hi, everybody. I'm Monica Serrano. I'm with Turner Construction. I lead our resiliency program, which basically boils down to making the buildings that we build more resilient, our job sites more resilient, and our business. I'm a mechanical engineer by trade. I have been in the construction management industry for 18 years, always with a passion for resiliency and sustainability. Happy to be here today.
Hey, everyone. My name's Joel Sonkin. As Brendan mentioned, I'm with Deloitte. I'm a climate change specialist leader. So what we really focus on is both ESG monitoring and reporting, but also helping our clients be able to understand both how to identify and manage their physical risk associated with climate, as well as help them on their path to net zero. My background is, have been working in sustainability and resilience for about 15 years, both in the public and private sector, and was initially trained as a lawyer, but not for a very long time, so please don't hold that too much against me.
Okay, hello, my name is Gonzalo Galindo. I'm with Cemex. I'm effectively the Chief Innovation Officer for Cemex, which include our internal innovation platform, but also Cemex Ventures, which is our open innovation and corporate venture platform as well. I've been with Cemex 20-something years already, probably one too many, but still alive. Managing business for them in the UK, here in the US, in Asia as well. And innovation for us is quite important because as a heavy emitter of CO2, it's through innovation that we will have to solve this problem and reach our net zero targets by 2040, 2050, give or take.
So much, and that I think hits on a pretty important topic there. First off, us having a need to transition. Before we actually jump into some of the terms today, I did also want to mention that for those who are tracking AIA credits, this does provide you eligibility for 3 credits. So yeah, feel free to follow up if you have any questions about that. But before we actually jump into the questions today, we felt it was really important to create a common language for this conversation. Whenever we're talking about climate change, we're always trying to strike that balance between education, unsure of where your businesses are all at today, but then also sharing thought leadership in these areas. So we flashed up a few terms on the board here today that we wanted our panelists just to help define for us, so that as we use them in the later parts of the conversation, that we're all mutually aligned. So with that being said, why don't we start with the term climate change, Sandra? You want to start with that one?
Okay, that's probably the hardest one, actually, to completely define. Climate change, I mean, very simply, very, very simply, it is just the effects of the way we live and the things we do as humans that affects our climate. That's a very simplistic, you could Google that, not really that hard to understand. The interesting thing really is how much, while we're here, is the climate change, how much that's affecting our environment, and especially how much it's affecting our natural hazards, hurricanes, all these kinds of things, right? So that's, I think, why climate change is up there. Yeah, pretty simple explanation for that one. So I'll give this next one to
Yeah, sure. And I'll add a little bit to this. So the reason why climate change is happening is basically we have put historically, since the Industrial Revolution, unprecedented levels of carbon. I think we are in like 420, and I know that because COP27 is happening now, and so it's on the news. But yes, there's unprecedented levels of carbon in the atmosphere, right? And that is just basically messing up with all the systems that we depend on, right? So construction, and as you were referring to, how that affects our industry, two industries are the most vulnerable: construction and agriculture, right? Because it's the essence of our work is outdoor work, right? So not only the buildings we build, but also our operations. Unless somebody comes with a very innovative, maybe Gonzalo, you can come up with this, a very innovative like bubble that goes over our job sites that is really resilient, we will continue to be vulnerable to extreme heat and floods and rain and so on and so forth, right? And so I'll define mitigation and sustainability, and I'll pass it over to Joel for adaptation and resilience. So there's two main things that we have to do in order to deal with this climate crisis: mitigation and adaptation. And mitigation is all about decarbonizing, right? So I just said we've put all these levels of, all this carbon in the atmosphere, unprecedented levels. It's about going to zero carbon, right? So diminishing the amount of carbon that we emit into the atmosphere. And sustainability, implementing sustainability in the buildings that we build and in the job sites we run is one way of doing that. Do you want to talk about adaptation and resilience?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So adaptation and resilience is kind of the other side of climate change, which is not so much how do you stop contributing to climate change, but how do you, as a person, as an organization, kind of survive and thrive with the impacts of climate change. So adaptation is really about how do you have to adjust your business, to adjust your lifestyle to deal with the ramifications. So that's kind of in two different forms, right? There's the physical risk, which is really how do you deal with the acute and chronic hazards associated with climate change. So acute are kind of the big events. So, you're talking about, extreme flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, et cetera. Chronic is the more day-to-day with, that there's going to be an increased amount of drought, more extreme heat days, more cold days that you're going to need to navigate. And then the other piece is transition risk, which is kind of a somewhat new concept, one that I think there's a lot of confusion around. But the basic idea is, as society as a whole starts shifting towards a low-carbon future out of necessity, realistically, what are those impacts going to be, and how are they going to impact your business? So what are the technological changes that are likely to take place? What are the regulatory changes that you're likely to be subject to? Are there going to be any market changes that you want to be able to anticipate and plan for? And then I guess the last is, are there going to be any kind of stakeholder changes? Are your customers going to have different and evolving expectations as a result of this?
Yeah, no, thank you. And so really we wanted to make sure that when we use these terms today that we're all kind of understanding how they fit into our overall climate goals and solutions. The last piece that we'd also like to share with the team before getting into more detailed question, Monica's prepared some slides for us to really understand more of where the sources of climate change are impacting construction today, both on the pre-construction and post-construction side.
So I think it's right after that one. Yeah, so this is basically the emissions by sector, right? So like this answers the question, okay, so why do we care? Why we in the construction industry, why should we care about adaptation and mitigation? It turns out our industry produces a lot of carbon. And so if you take a look at that, just building operations is about 28% of the pie. Now, building operations or efficiency in buildings has gotten a lot of attention, right, in the last decade or maybe even two. And so that piece of the pie will become smaller. Now, where we haven't put enough attention is on embodied carbon, right? And that's the yellow pieces of the pie that add up to like 21%. And embodied carbon is the carbon that is emitted during the extraction of materials from nature, manufacturing, transporting those products to a job site, and installing them. So it's all the carbon that has been emitted when a brand new building opens its doors. And it turns out it's a pretty big piece of the pie. And so we have to put attention to it. The biggest culprits, concrete and steel. And the biggest culprit within concrete is cement. The good news is there are alternatives. The good news of all this crisis is that solutions exist. We just need to implement them. And there'll be more solutions and more innovative technologies coming out, but we have to implement them. But the point of this is our industry is really carbon heavy, but that is, poses an opportunity. We have a lot of room for improvement. And let's go to the next slide. This one ties to what I was talking about, right? So it's the differentiation between embodied carbon and operational carbon. So again, embodied carbon, the carbon that has been emitted during extraction, manufacturing, transportation of materials, and installation. Operational carbon is the carbon that is emitted during the life of the building, right? And maintenance and repairs. So yeah, hopefully that sets the stage for the next conversation. Absolutely.
Thanks, Monica. So with that being said, and now that we have a decent understanding of the different terms that we'll be using today, why don't we start things off with questions? Joel, I'll actually kick the first one off to you. Obviously at Deloitte, you're representing all sorts of clients who are creating strategies to mitigate some of these risks that you called out there. Do you mind sharing a little bit about what you're seeing in the industry and any industries that you'd see are maybe further ahead of the curve in creating plans to address those risks?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess first I'll address kind of which industries have been a little bit ahead. And those are largely industries that have already been impacted by extreme weather events, unsurprisingly. So, for us, the one that we see that's the furthest forward is the military. Because for them, mission assurance is critical, and if they're disrupted because of any extreme weather event, it could mean life and death for a number of people. Also, oil and gas is a big mover. The chemical industry has been public utilities, unsurprisingly, for similar reasons, have seen themselves be very heavily impacted by extreme weather events. And then lastly, we're seeing kind of an increase in a lot of entities that make significant investments in physical infrastructure. So REITs, other institutional investors really want to have an increased understanding of both the likelihood of different physical events occurring, how that's going to change over time, and being able to kind of quantify that and help that inform their decisions. So that's been a big thing that we have been focused on, is being able to provide that quantitative assessment. So I think one of the big misunderstandings around physical risk is, in a lot of ways, a lot of people feel that it's kind of impossible to anticipate where extreme weather events are going to occur. It's very difficult to kind of quantify the return on investment for investing in risk mitigation measures, and just in the world of kind of big data and AI, that's just really not true anymore. You are able to really understand pretty well kind of like where your vulnerabilities lie and how that's going to increase and change over time.
No, thanks, Joel. Monica, do you have anything to add maybe from the builder side on that, or that kind of cover it as well?
Yeah. So I agree with Joel. We are at a point in time in which we cannot say, oh, I don't know how to quantify it, right? And even from the builder's perspective, even though our job site will not last for 50 years like a building would, just what I mentioned, our job sites are vulnerable. They're open to the weather. And there are ways to incorporate resiliency in the job site phase as well. So just the awareness, right, that there are hazards that can affect our job sites and that they're happening more often and they're more intense. And so preparing everybody in the site, understanding what hazards can affect the job site, having preparedness plans in place, and even certain things like a storm shelter or have a hurricane preparedness plan in place. All of that can make our job site more resilient. From the worker perspective, extreme heat is a huge hazard that will affect our job sites. And sometimes it's hard to kind of see it because it's not as impactful right away as a hurricane. It's just very slow and steady. But to give you an example, OSHA has guidelines, but they're guidelines. They're not enforced guidelines on after a certain temperature, the guidelines say that depending on the level of the work, if it's intense or medium or not so intense, workers are to take breaks. And if you take a look at the guidelines, if it's really intense work, for every hour, they're to take like a 50-minute break and then work for 10 minutes. So talk about productivity, right? So OSHA is revising their guidelines. I'm not sure if they're gonna continue being guidelines or regulations, but this is something we have to do something about, right? We don't think about that when we put schedules together. We just kind of assume that we're gonna go on with, productive folks. But I mean, it's our human body is designed in a way that after a certain wet bulb temperature, we don't sweat anymore. The productivity lowers, and in the long term, there's consequences to our workers' health. So that is one hazard that we're gonna have to put a lot of attention on.
Got it. That tees us up really well for our next question here, which is, how do we see the regulatory environment shifting, and maybe where do you see the built environment having an opportunity to anticipate any of those risks?
Well, I think regulatory environment has to be tougher and has to evolve. Otherwise, this is not going to happen. And you can see, for example, compared to Europe, where we have a very tough regulation for the last 20 years regarding emissions, you can see industrial products like ours emitting far less than the same product here in the US, no? Because they have already a regulatory environment, a CAMPA trade system, and so on, which forces us to work in decarbonizing our operations. I mean, for example, in Cemex, we've been decarbonizing our operations, even here in the US, for the last 20 years. It's not nothing that we're starting today because we have the pressure. I mean, in fact, today we are producing cements which are 30–40% less emitted, with less emissions, 30–40% less emissions than the ones we produced in 2001, for example. No? And also, regulation comes with the carrot and the stick as well. No? Just the stick doesn't work. You need to provide means and funds for those technologies to be developed and to be commercially available. Decarbonizing industrial installations, including oil and gas or whatever, it's very expensive. And you need projects which need and require a lot of participation of different entities. I mean, transforming CO2 into synthetic methanol can take 3 or 4 companies together to make it happen. No? And it will cost $1 billion a project. No? So that, if governments do not support the carrot for those projects to be economically viable, it's going to be very hard to make it happen. No? And so regulatory framework is very important. It's the driver of what is going to happen, but it has to be a little bit of carrot and stick, otherwise it is not going to work.
On that note, I hope you all voted today. If this is important to you, hopefully you voted for those people that will make these regulations happen. I do think that bills like the Inflation Reduction Act, there were some funds there for both resiliency and mitigation. A couple of laws and policies that I have seen in just the last couple of years. Local Law 97 in New York, that is more of a stick type of law. If building owners, if the building does not meet a certain energy intensity per square footage, if it's above that, then there is a fine that the building owner has to pay per square footage. Most recently, and this is more on the job site side, I'm going to get the name wrong, it's something like Clean Construction Act in New York City. And so it's all about encouraging electric equipment in job sites, embodied carbon quantification, development of EPDs. And I'll tell you, we meter about 100+ job sites a year. We meter electricity, we meter gas, we meter water, and we convert that to carbon. And the biggest culprit is gas. So the quicker you can get off of gas and electrify during construction, and this, I think, electrifying buildings, it applies to buildings as well, the better, and the less carbon intensive you'll be.
Got it. That's really helpful. And then any other maybe areas where builders should be anticipating changes, or primarily around reducing carbon in their products and making job sites more environmentally friendly? Anything else?
Well, I mean, I think one other area in which you're likely to see an increase in regulations, and I think in some places like New York City, you're already seeing that, is around kind of building in certain climate resilience standards. So, insisting essentially on certain levels of infrastructure hardening that's going to need to take place, either wet floodproofing or dry floodproofing, facilities that are within kind of anticipated flood zones. So I think, certainly becoming as familiar as possible, with various, flood risk reduction technologies makes a lot of sense. And also the concept of building kind of adaptive capacity into a lot of buildings. That's something else that I know has been a big issue, certainly in New York, which I think is likely to expand outwards to other places as they start getting hit by their own Superstorm Sandys. But the idea there is essentially, if you know that there is likely to be an increase in the amount of weather risk in the future, you may not need to kind of build that standard into a building, but you need to build that building with the capability of adding that standard at a later date without having to do a really expensive retrofit.
So there's the elephant in the room, which of course is what's going on today. And if you're from North America or the U.S., we all know that the SEC is going through this huge process. We anticipate, no one knows, I don't think any of us know for sure, but we anticipate that if you're a publicly traded company, that you will be reporting your entire carbon footprint, whether you're a contractor or an owner, and it will be available for investors to begin to look at. The other piece as far as regulation is if you receive any of IIJA money, also known as the Infrastructure Act, and also the Inflation Reduction Bill, which has nothing to do with inflation, but at any rate, if you receive either of those, there are strict requirements as well. So we don't have it yet. The UK and Europe is way ahead of us, but it is coming.
Just to complement on that one, the SEC might do that. We don't know yet. But something we are feeling already is investors is requiring a more stringent communication with regards to our environmental and sustainability performance. And in fact, many companies like us, in our integrated report on a yearly basis, are reporting already our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions already. And it's a situation which is more widely used by a lot of companies already than expected. And sooner or later, with or without the CSCC, investors and the big funds and the BlackRock of Steve Worlds, they are forcing us to be more transparent.
Yes, that's true.
So yeah, go ahead.
In Canada, a law was passed earlier this year, and I know that because we have offices in Canada. And so banks and insurers have to disclose their climate risks starting in January 2024. And so what that means for companies like Turner, we work with insurers and banks. So insurers and banks are going to turn to us and say, did you assess your climate risk? And so we're trying to figure out how to do that. So I think there will be many forces, like all of the panelists have mentioned. And so get ahead. That's basically my one advice is get ahead, start looking at climate risk, start looking at scope accounting. So when it comes, we're not all surprised.
Got it. That's really helpful. So what I heard was that there's a lot of regulatory changes that are coming, and you better expect some changes to come. But regardless, preparing yourself is a good measure to be taking there. Awesome. Okay, and so that kind of brings us to our next piece here. Where are you seeing companies innovate in preparing themselves for the impacts of climate change?
Okay, I start. I think a lot of innovation is happening around the sustainability responsibilities that we have as a company. For example, the decarbonization. You just mentioned the oil and gas and military are well advanced. But the fact is that, for example, in carbon capture, a technology which works in oil and gas not necessarily will work in power, not necessarily will work at doing the same efficiency in cement, for example. So even though the technologies are there, we still need a lot of twisting, because why? Our gases are different, the concentration of CO2 might be different, and then the other thing is what to do with the CO2. I mean, you can capture it, but then you need to do something about it. It's about storage, it's about converting into something else. So those are projects which will require a lot of innovation and technologies, which many of them are still 3 to 5 years away of being commercially ready, available, and economically viable. Because some of them work, but they're very expensive, and you don't want to pay for concrete 40% more just because I need to capture the CO2. No? You want to pay what is worth paying for concrete and for me to get a decent return. No? So it is a lot of innovation, the one which need to happen between now and 2030, 40, and 50 to actually make sure that we reach the net zero that we all are offering to comply with the 1.5 degrees scenarios, no? And that is still a challenge and plenty of money to be invested.
But to that I will add, there are a lot of solutions that already exist and we are not all implementing. So I'll give you an example. We have a job site, we're building a library in Connecticut. And so cement, as I mentioned, biggest culprit when it comes to embodied carbon. And so there is a glass recycling plant in Connecticut near the site. And we brought up to the client the potential of using positive. So positive is recycled glass. And so you can use recycled glass in lieu of cement, and it will have similar structural performance. And in this case, there was no cost difference. And so we use positive instead of cement in all the concrete for this library. Again, no cost, same structural performance, and the carbon in the concrete was about 98% less. So huge improvement in embodied carbon in concrete, and it was viable in that it may not be viable for every single job site, but there are solutions out there. There's fly ash and there's many other options to use instead of cement that can be implemented. Now, what is difficult is to think of them and to implement them and to have those conversations with clients, designers. So it's kind of like, it's just transform the way we build buildings. That is the hardest part. But I have faith that we can all do it.
So actually, just to build on that, I mean, to me, the really most meaningful innovation that I think has happened recently has been this shift away from climate being kind of like a standalone siloed effort for an organization of having, like a sustainability officer who has their own kind of separate agenda. I think that the truth is that, both climate adaptation and sustainability, it's very specific to the specific organization. And it's all about really, I think, embedding it into the internal decision-making and being as opportunistic as possible. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And I think, to your point, around the library, a lot of times there are ways in which you can kind of increase your climate readiness in a way that actually has a positive impact on your bottom line or provides other co-benefits. And I think orienting your action in those directions is probably a really important step.
Yeah, and one other thing that I think we don't always think about is academia. Right, and so we have several universities who are working on how do we take cement and some of these recycled materials or materials that can be and actually turn into an aggregate wood. So there really is, to your point, is there hope? Yes. Is it coming quickly? I don't know. And then to your point, as far as cost, I sort of liken it to, remember when everyone everything was organic produce, right? And it was like, that's great, but it's too expensive. I think that's going to be an interesting challenge as we go forward.
Yeah, but just to finish on that one, and reinforcing something Monica said, and probably Joel as well, is there are available products today, but you need to specify them. Myself or many of my competitors can offer today cements with concrete with 70% less embodied carbon already today at a decent cost price. Exactly at market price, but we need to force this to be specified, otherwise it's very hard, and for us it's very hard to be with the specifier telling him it has to come also from our customers.
Yeah, and so that becomes a question. So we have owners and contractors in here, and that is, are the owners going to specify that? Are the GCs going to jump into that? And if they don't, and their challenge is, who's liable? I have a good friend attorney here sitting in the front room. I'm not going to answer that. I'm not the attorney. But that's also another big piece. Even if we develop these wonderful technologies, and even if they're somewhat cost effective, how do we make sure they're used? Traditionally, we always talked about cost and schedule. My perspective, I say it all the time, is I think we have another third element now that we'll be tracking.
I also just to kind of like help encourage everybody to kind of engage in those more forward-looking technologies. I mean, I think, Monica mentioned Local Law 97 in New York, and I do think that that's likely to be a model. And just to be clear on the intent of that, that's essentially from an owner standpoint, if your collection of buildings is above a certain amount, you have to reduce your emissions, which means that the decisions that you make now, you could then be responsible for, having to retrofit at a much higher cost, possibly even just 5-10 years downstream. So I think that there's also, from a regulatory standpoint, a strong incentive to want to anticipate that and take action before you're stuck having to fix a problem downstream.
Well, it sounds like innovation is coming across all the different stakeholders, all the way from policy through to the investments into these buildings and the suppliers and builders as well. So I'm glad that we have representation from all those people here today. We're making really good use on time, so why don't we keep going here, and then I think we might dig in a bit more to some of those other ones you brought up there. But what recommendations might you offer to companies that are early in understanding the impacts of climate change to their business, and where might you suggest they get started?
I guess I'll start there, and then we'll go down the line if you'd like. I think it seems so hard and so big, but first you have to figure out where you are. I mean, it sounds very simplistic, but you can't figure out where you're going until you kind of take an assessment of where you are in just a very, very basic way, right? So even if regulations come along, so ideally you have your goal and you know where you are, and then the work is, this is just like project management, right? So I think that's the first. So I'm talking really practical. I'm not the theorist here. But also, if we think about construction, just in its basic, it's what? Labor, materials, and equipment. I mean, it's an insanely complex industry, but it still pretty much boils down to those three things. Material is the one you'll hear an awful lot about, but we did hear about equipment. Equipment is another really big piece. And then labor. How far do you use local labor? Do we ship them in? This is particularly important in global overseas, engineering and construction, oil and gas, that kind of thing. So I sort of take it to a very basic level. Construction is made of those three things. Everything we do should be focused on at least one of those three things.
Yeah, I fully agree. I would say, once you figure out where you're at, do something, right? Pick one thing and then just focus on that. You could track your embodied carbon. I mean, there are tools out there that can help you do this. So you don't even need to start with like a goal of reducing your embodied carbon. Just start tracking it. Identify a project and quantify the embodied carbon. You can use EC3 or you can use other tools, quantify your embodied carbon. It is integrated with Procore. There you go. On the adaptation side, I think one thing that we all need to be aware of is future climate will be different than historical climate. We can no longer plan for historical climate because our future will be different. And so integrating that into your decisions, and Joel alluded to that before, integrating that into your decisions, into the buildings you build, into the job sites, it is absolutely key.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of build on what both of you were saying, to me, I mean, the number one thing that I would do if it were my company would be to really, one, kind of talk to your staff and try to really get a broader understanding of how does climate potentially impact your business. You and your people know your business way better than anybody else does, and there's no kind of specific solution. So I think it's really a question of like, what are the potential vulnerabilities that your business might face, either from a physical standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, from a market standpoint, and just as important, where are the opportunities? Right? I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways in which there's going to be winners and losers in this kind of broader transition to climate, and how are you going to be able to better position your company to be more resilient to that change and to maybe thrive in comparison to some of your competitors that are going to be catching up to you. So I would try to be as strategic as possible and to some degree as self-interested as possible in figuring out kind of how to act on climate.
Can I add? I'll add one more thing to that. The opportunities is key. We have been talking about, resilience and risk and vulnerabilities, but there's a huge opportunity there. And the younger generations that will be leading all of our companies in a decade or two really care about this. So there is a reputation aspect of our companies. We need to keep up with the game because they're not going to give us the job if we're not sustainable, if we're not resilient, if we're not looking at our climate risk.
I think this problem is really probably one of the most important issues that the society, that the world needs to solve in the next few years. And it's a problem, it's not going to be solved like in an island by one guy, and that's it. I mean, we need to cooperate a lot. We need to talk, GCs with material suppliers, with specifiers. We have to be all in the same synchronicity to actually make it happen, because these solutions are not necessarily simple to implement sometimes, are not necessarily economically viable now, but if we work together and we can do things together with the same objective, sooner or later this problem will start receding and we will start winning the battle. It's something that me, by myself, cannot solve alone. We need the help of everybody in our ecosystem.
I think those are some very practical takeaways for the audience here today. So realizing that I probably have a lot more questions I'd like to ask, but we have about 10 minutes, and I'm sure there's probably some questions in the audience as well. So we'd like to open it up to any Q&A if people are interested. Feel free to raise your hands, and maybe I'll run the microphone out to you. Nope, going once. Okay. Well, with that being said, maybe we can dig back into some of the roles between the owner and the GC. I think that was we just scratched the surface of that one.
Maybe we can talk about waste.
And waste as well?
Yeah.
Sure, okay. Let's do that then. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about the impacts of waste, and do you see that being an accumulated risk in the industry as well?
So if you know me at all, I'm always talking about waste. I think embodied carbon is insanely important. Please don't get me wrong. Building operations is insanely important. But the piece that I find that people, it's almost like it's really no one's problem, so it just sits out there. And I'm sure you know, but 30% of building materials end up as waste. That's huge. And to make that even more interesting, so hopefully now maybe we'll have some questions, but of that 30%, 75% of that ends up in landfills. And so this is where I think things also get interesting, which is, okay, we actually, in my opinion, we have some really good tools now for embodied carbon with smart buildings and digital twin. I think we can do a lot with building operations, with innovations we've just talked about in materials, but there's still this one piece out there that this isn't new. I mean, if you've been in construction, you know there's waste. So I'll leave it there and let you guys jump in on that.
Just to complement a little bit, that's waste, it's very important, I agree completely. And it's another one which regulation can do a lot to make it simpler, faster, easier. Again, France, you have to recycle the vast majority of, if you demolish one building, you have to use as much as you can of that building again somewhere, in some sort of building material, construction, concrete, whatever, no? And that's just regulation. It's the city of Paris, the Grande Paris they're building, the surrounding for the Olympics and so on, everything has to be, the vast majority will be recycled. And it's about will and regulation.
Yes, I agree with that. But then there has to be circularity, right? So because we simply, if today we recycle 100% of the materials that come from the building, today, there is not a circular economy. And all of those materials that end up in the recycling plant, there's not enough demand for them. And we can all do a part on it, right? So designers, contractors, we have to talk, at least we have to converse about circularity. When it comes to buildings, we have to help owners, and I say we because I'm coming from the GC side, we have to question, do we really need to demolish that building? Can we renovate it? There's some demolition is what produces the most amount of waste. And so there's a lot of resources in buildings, right? And in the future, we can think about building buildings that can be deconstructed, right? But that needs a lot of planning. I mean, waste, it's so complex. It is so complex. But it does need a lot of attention because you mentioned 30% of the waste ends up in the landfills, right? Or does not get recycled.
It just doesn't, and 75% of that's in landfills, yeah.
And I think this is by weight, right?
Yes,
So
I didn't get into
weight, yeah, so weight is the unit used for waste. And so that means the landfill, and I have seen it, landfills are full of light materials. So insulation, carpet. So even though 30% might not seem like a lot, it is a lot, but it's even more because it's by weight. And so the materials that are light do not get any attention.
In a way, you need to make landfilling expensive. Otherwise, it's not going to work. UK, you want to landfill 1 ton is 180 pounds per ton to be landfill. So you think twice if you want to landfill something.
And I'll add one more thing. We all have suffered from supply chain strains lately, right? There is a source of materials in waste. And so, as a society, we use the resources that 1.4 planets can regenerate. So that is not a sustainable way of living, right? And so we're going to run out of resources. And so in waste, there is a source for more materials that can help the supply chain strains in, sometime when we figure out circularity.
That's a great point. And I made a mistake. I guess we actually are at time. So I started a whole rabbit hole for us. But thank you all for attending the session today. Really appreciate your time and attention. Please feel free to come up and ask us questions if you'd like.